Professor of botany at University of Wisconsin-Madison, illustrates this when he says, quote, "Mammals have 5 digits. There is no physical reason for mammals having 5 digits on their hands and feet, because it comes not from physical limits, but from the constraints of having a mammal heritage. Any number of digits is possible within the physical limits. But in mammals, only 5 digits are allowed as the biological constraints. Constraints come from above, while the limits as to what is possible comes from below." The concept of hierarchy becomes confused unless one makes the distinction between limits from below and limits from above. The distinction between mechanisms below and purposes above turns on the issue of constraint versus possibility. Forget the distinction and biology becomes pointlessly confused, impossibly complicated chemistry, whilst chemistry becomes unwieldy physics.